Hello and welcome to Policy and Politics with me, Tarun Nangia. Our topic of today is revisiting caste and the narratives built around it. And to discuss this issue, we have a special guest. We have with us Advocate J.Sai Deepak, who is an advocate practicing in the Supreme Court of India and the Delhi High Court. I welcome you, Mr. J.Sai Deepak, on today's show of Policy and Politics. Really appreciate you joining us, taking out time on the day when the courts are functional and you happen to be arguing. Thank you so much. But because we have little time, we have to get straight to the point. When I say revisiting caste and this topic, could you give me an introductory comment of what all comes to your mind? Because you have serious thoughts on this subject.
So thank you, Tarun, for this opportunity to discuss such an important topic in the backdrop of what's been going on over the last few weeks in the country. I think the understanding of caste and the use of caste, especially over the last 3 to 4 decades, has been extremely divisive, despite the attempt of the framers of the Constitution to forge a society on, let's say, on some common ground. Okay. Unfortunately, the conduct of people, the conduct of dramatis personae is at loggerheads with the intention of the framers of the Constitution. And this is largely because I think we have purchased or bought lock, stock and barrel opinions with respect to caste, and the history of caste that we seem to subscribe to these days is largely a colonialized version of this particular structure. And unfortunately, we have not been able to put out research or put out scholarship which clearly shows that it is time that Bharat as a country decides to throw off the yoke of colonialism, even when it comes to its thinking with respect to issues of social organization. So issues such as caste, or let's say whether caste itself is the right term to be used for this particular form of social structure, is something that we have to revisit. And I think slowly we are inching towards that particular form of scholarship and erudition, which may help us understand these structures better, so that we can stop using this as a divisive tool and as a cynical electoral arithmetics of sorts. Okay. And we are able to forge a society which has a greater sense of being part of the same civilization, as opposed to finding micro identities and micro markers to keep dividing ourselves.
Now, if what we understand in the present of caste today, has it been the idea of caste always, I mean, since times immemorial, or has it changed?
See, I don't think it's possible to treat any social structure as far as Bharat is concerned, or its civilizational weave is concerned, as a static structure, given that it has had a journey of at the very least 7,000 recorded years, not 5,000, much beyond that. And that's what research is showing, and that's what archaeology is telling us, that 7,000 years is at the very least you're looking at this particular civilization. Now, the second thing that we have to understand is, therefore, every structure, every construct, and every concept has undergone a certain degree of change in this journey of 7,000 years. And what we know today as caste is effectively a rigid ossified structure which was created for administrative purposes by the Christian European white colonizer. And this is a recorded fact. And this is something that is not peculiar to India. This is something that every colonized society has undergone, wherein their domestic structures or their internal structures have been given a racial connotation by the European colonizer, because race was something that the European colonizer was obsessed with. Therefore, the only form of social organization, or the only form of, let's say, a social structurization or classification, was a race-based classification, which has happened in the Americas, which is both the North America as well as South America, which has happened in the Caribbean, which has happened in New Zealand, which has happened in Africa. Therefore, unfortunately, what has happened is, we've been reading Indian history, especially our colonial experience, in a silo, in a walled garden, so to speak, because of which we have not had the benefit of comparing and contrasting what other colonized societies have undergone, so that we understand that the treatment of domestic communities or indigenous communities, so to speak, has been largely similar by the European colonizer, which was to stratify them, divide them, and to give them a sense of, let's say, perhaps constantly pit them against each other. Okay. Therefore, caste as we understand today, or even the word tribe as we understand it today, is largely an English import. That's not the language, and that's not the concept we subscribe to.
Now, if I take this narrative ahead in terms of what you say, then what becomes the Indian lexicon of caste? How do we understand it in today's context? And of course, what flows from history and what it has come to today?
So the Indian terminology that we typically try and conflate with caste, and perhaps we don't have a sense of clarity, is jati, and of course Varna, and there's of course the third construct called Kula. Okay. Now, scholars from Ramakrishna Mission, traditional scholars, scholars who have understood and deeply read, let's say, the scripture, the social evolution of this particular country, are very, very clear about the fact that Varna is effectively a spiritual classification. Jati is effectively a birth-based plus vocation-based classification. And Kula translates to clan. So perhaps you can leave Kul out of this particular equation and you can focus exclusively on Jati and Varna. And you have to understand that you're looking at constructs which were developed in pre-industrialized societies, wherein professions were specialized and specialized by certain groups and limited to certain groups. This is not limited to India, by the way. If you look at the Dutch East Indies, if you look at the history of Indonesia, if you look at Burma or any other place, every society has had special groups which had special monopoly over certain professions. That's been the nature of social stratification across the world prior to the advent of the industrial civilization, where the vocation of the father would effectively be transferred to the son. The son would effectively inherit the father's vocation. In fact, he would start as the apprentice of the father. His first teacher in the profession was his father himself. Okay. Therefore, I think we have to perhaps rid ourselves of the use of this term called caste and try and understand Varna and Jati on their own terms in the manner in which they were used in the context of the Indic civilization, as opposed to looking at it through the lens of the colonizer.
Now, because I remember an article that I was reading yesterday in reference to what you're speaking to me. In the area called Noida, which is adjacent of the national capital of Delhi, there happens to be an area called Sapero Ki Basti, which is basically translated loosely into English would mean that a locality or a township of snake catchers. So it proved two things, that this locality A had a lot of snakes, and that is why you needed a community to go out and catch snakes. It still exists. So were you referring to something like that when you said that trades were in a sense monopolized? If not monopolized, identified with certain communities, like Sapero Ki Basti is one example.
Right. So what would happen is, if you look at the, even let's say the manner in which town planning took place in the southern part of the country under the Cholas or the Cheras or the Pandyas, what they would do is that the temple, or at least a central temple, would be the focal point or the epicenter of town planning, around which the city would be divided. And each community which has a certain specialization or a special vocation would be given a certain place in that particular society or in that particular city. Because the idea was, those people who subscribe to a similar micro way of life or to a similar sub way of life must be able to live together, so that certain community practices, certain community ways of life are given certain safe spaces, to put it in today's language. Okay. Assume for a moment that you happen to be let's say a practitioner of a certain profession that requires you to be a vegetarian, either because you teach the scripture or you practice the scripture by way of dance or sculpture, so on and so forth. Okay. It's not something that is limited to your practice alone. You would want to be part of a certain group and live amongst a certain group which ascribes or subscribes to the very same set of values and to the very same way of life, so that there is harmony. Unfortunately, what we have effectively done is to basket this particular tendency as some kind of narrow ghettoization. We have given it negative connotations, as opposed to saying that people who are comfortable living with each other as a consequence of specific ways of life that they commonly subscribe to must have the liberty to live together. Okay. Now let's try and contrast this with the current day situation. When the modern developer decides to sell a certain flat or a certain community, what is he effectively telling you? You will live among people who are as educated as you, who subscribe to the same ways of life or values that you subscribe to. So rest assured, you're effectively living among, let's say, in a community of your peers. Okay. So how is it different from what was being practiced before? The difference, of course, is the question of rigidity. Was there movement possible from one community to another? Was there a certain degree of freedom available to an individual to choose to leave the community of his ancestors and to join some other community and embrace a different way of life? On this, there is enough literature to suggest that movements have not been exceptional. They have acquired a certain status. However, largely because of its pre-industrialized society or status, so to speak, movements have not been as frequent. That's not proof of the fact that movement was prohibited. That's merely proof of the fact that movement was not deemed necessary except in isolated instances. Okay, that is something that we don't seem to recognize.
Sai, I have two questions at this point. Certain narratives in the present context on the issue of caste are very typical, wherein which you identify certain communities. Example, even in modern movies, you would associate certain caste with certain roles that are given. And it basically deeply, in a sense, entrenches. For example, you hear many, say, today's stand-up comedians saying that, okay, a certain community is identified as very rich or businessmen or say, for example, Thakurs who are always shown as rich or maybe leading in a certain. So are movies responsible for, in a sense, making people identify castes with businesses or social, in a sense, position in society?
Pop culture effectively represents only the top soil, and it effectively represents an upward percolation of sorts where mass representation becomes more simplistic and has absolutely no nuance. But I don't think it's fair to blame pop culture entirely, because pop culture is populated by those people who have consumed certain literature, and the primary literature that most people end up citing are textbooks in schools, are history textbooks in schools and colleges. Therefore, the problem is not with pop culture. Pop culture is merely reflecting what the education system of this particular country, at least since the 50s and 60s.
But Sai, then there are things like, yesterday there was a textbook extract which was circulating on Twitter, and I also need to, in a sense, verify it, which said that in the case of Nathuram Godse, it is mentioned in one of the NCERT textbooks that a Brahmin killed Mahatma Gandhi. So you do not identify him as Nathuram Godse, a criminal. You identify him as a Brahmin, in effect vilifying the whole community for an act of an individual. Do you think such references need to be refrained from?
No, in fact, I think it's important to highlight, if they really want to mention the fact that a Brahmin killed Nathuram Godse, then they must take it to the next step and also point out to students and children that close to 8,000 to 12,000 Brahmins in Maharashtra were wiped out as a consequence of a genocide, which was committed by Hindus as well as non-Hindus against the Brahmin community of the Maharashtrians, specifically the Chitpavan Brahmins and others also, because they believed that the Brahmin community was in some kind of a conspiracy to wipe out the so-called Mahatma. Therefore, if you want to identify the community of the assassin, you might as well also identify the repercussions that the community faced as a consequence of a clear genocide, close to 12,000 people.
But Sai, if you omit that, then what does it show? Because the textbook, in my view, has not mentioned it, because the extract that I read never said it.
If you omit that particular reference, therefore, there is a clear malicious stereotyping of a specific Indic subset and a specific identity. The problem is that we end up looking at it from the standpoint of which particular caste is being vilified, without understanding that ultimately it loosens the bonds which hold together this particular civilization from within, making it extremely vulnerable to influences from outside. Whenever the community's internal bonds are effectively loosened and divided, someone from the outside benefits. And most importantly, there is always an external beneficiary who's perhaps the prime mover behind these kinds of vociferous tendencies. And that has been the history, not just in Bharat, but elsewhere as well. Therefore, I am not willing to treat this particular instance as some kind of an academic aberration or an innocent instance. According to me, this is part of a very clear agenda, a very clear vision to balkanize the Indic society first and then balkanize Bharat as a country.
So if I take this argument further, then there is this whole attempt to paint Dalits and Hindus as separate. Where does this seed originate from? Because this seems to be the dominant narrative of a certain type of people these days, or people subscribing to a certain ideology.
So we all know that, of course, the word Dalit was coined by Dr. Ambedkar. And Dr. Ambedkar may or may not have wanted to leave the Hindu fold, but he was certainly looking for respect for this particular community within the Hindu fold. However, I think the discourse on the Dalit identity should not be limited only to Dr. Ambedkar, because obviously he never claimed monopoly over it. He was not that kind of person. There were other people also, especially from the South. For instance, MC Raja was a Dalit activist from the South, who clearly said, when missionaries approached him to convert to Christianity and bring along with him the rest of his community members, he clearly said, if you think that this fight is about getting out of the Hindu fold, you've got us wrong. We are Hindus first and we will die as Hindus. And We are asking for equal treatment as Hindus worthy of respect within this particular community. So kindly don't use this internal conversation within the Hindu community to benefit certain evangelical proselytization interests. That's not what we are up for. In fact, I've read literature which clearly shows that he had a conversation to this effect even with Dr. Ambedkar, which is perhaps why when Dr. Ambedkar chose to effectively leave, let's say, the Hindu fold, so to speak, the religion that he chose was still within the dharmic fold, which is Buddhism. And if you look at Article 25 of the Constitution, the explanation clearly tells you that Hinduism includes Buddhists, Sikhs, Jains, and others, right? Therefore, for all practical purposes, Dr. Ambedkar did not leave the Hindu fold. Anybody who subscribes to Dr. Ambedkar's vision or his identity, so to speak, may at best transition to these identities which are within the dharmic fold, but are clearly not outside the scope of either Hinduism or, let's say, the dharmic fold. So I think history is very clear, facts are clear. Unfortunately, opinions are divorced from facts.
There is a certain narrative being peddled to a huge majority of youths today, college students. What is the possible impact if such narratives are not clarified, controlled? You cannot control these days, but you can clarify. And you need a counter clarification, because otherwise, are we leading to a society which will be divided and there will be fault lines, going through the heart of society in the coming decades?
See, the first thing is we have to ask ourselves, is retribution the goal or reconciliation the goal? Okay. If retribution is the goal, then we might as well be clear about it so that everybody can look out for themselves. Okay. But if reconciliation is the goal, I think it's extremely important to understand history and clarify facts. The unfortunate reality today is that the generation or the times we live in has significantly come down with respect to original first-hand reading. Therefore, what we consume are primetime debates, we consume WhatsApp University, we consume memes, and we consume the shortest possible forms of information which lack nuance and where facts really have no place, only opinions and rhetoric have place. Okay. So today, if we continue down this path, I suspect that we will start seeing an internal fratricide, an internal genocide of sorts that will start from, let's say, the villages. And it has already happened. I think you remember 2 weeks ago or so, 3 Brahmin children were killed, their eyes were gouged out. And not because of any other reason, but precisely because of their caste identity. Okay. And unfortunately, mainstream media did not cover this. This reverse form of discrimination and reverse genocide, so to speak. But
this is as cruel as it can get. But shouldn't there be a message sent across by having a trial of sorts for such crimes, so that such crimes they never happen again? Second, there should be a huge counter propaganda, because if people are just killed on because they conform or part of a certain caste group, then don't you think it's a reason to worry at the highest levels in the government? It can't be just let or be ignored this way. It's not just the media, it's the government also that should take cognizance when such things occur.
See, I certainly expect the government to take cognizance and take a position. But before that, the first thing that must happen is that the society must wake up and start talking to each other. Because let's say this kind of an incident should not translate to some kind of a supremacist response from any community. And there should be no belligerence where, let's say, one community decides to teach another community with a lesson, because ultimately we are part of the same community. And the more we fight on these lines, the more we allow ourselves to be divided on these lines, I repeat, somebody else is going to benefit, and Bharat as a nation will be weakened at the national level as well as at the international level, and dare I say at the civilizational level. Therefore, the conversation must start from within the community. When the community takes it seriously, the government will take it seriously. Unfortunately, the community has been mum and has maintained the deathly silence, pun intended.
Sai, 2 things: A, the courts, and B, secondly, do you think there is a planned conspiracy, if I may call it, to drive a wedge between castes and reap political benefits, not in the normal sense as regional politician parties have been doing, because India has a tradition of caste-based parties, but as a plan, in a sense, to drive a wedge and a fault line between castes and hence break religion itself?
I am someone who's extremely wary of putting stock in conspiracy theories, but this much I can say based on my reading of history, let's say of other jurisdictions, that there have been vested interests which are external to a particular community, which have triggered and which have benefited from dividing the indigenous community on different lines. either on religious lines or on sectarian lines, or let's say caste as a wedge or racial lines, by introducing all sorts of theories. And there is enough literature, at least since 1989, which has emerged from Latin America, from scholars like Anibal Quijano, Catherine E. Walsh, Walter Di Mignolo, Nelson Maldonado Torres, Sylvia Winter. Each of these people are giants in their own fields who have studied the impact of colonialism on colonized societies and the lasting legacy of the, let's say, the divisive tendency introduced by the colonizer into the indigenous society. And I dare say that what we are seeing is a continued impact, perhaps with a certain level of rejuvenation, because people are uncomfortable with Bharat asserting its Indic identity and its civilizational identity. Therefore, I dare say that the next few years, or at least for the next half a decade or so, we are going to see a rise of such instances until the community awakens and starts putting together an institutional response, a societal response, and dare I say within the metes and bounds of the Constitution, to deal with this menace head on, as opposed to watching it as a mute spectator from the sidelines.
Okay, if you see particularly in the case of Tamil Nadu, the caste, in a sense, certain castes were vilified, and in a sense, we know the whole movement which happened, the Dravida movement which happened. And there was, in a sense, a fallout because of that movement. Certain castes were identified and targeted. Do you think India can save itself from such politics? Because this is the politics of a kind where, societies can be impacted greatly.
India can save itself from a repeat of what I call perhaps an evangelical driven let's say genocide of certain Indic sub-identities, provided it starts paying attention to its past, provided it starts paying attention to history. Every person who is worth his salt in the realm of history will tell you that history is of extreme importance, not just to the present, but also to the future. Okay. And unfortunately, India has not paid enough attention to come out with its own version of its own history based on its own experience, and has continued to purchase and consume lock, stock, and barrel versions of history written in Harvard, in Yale, or any other place, as opposed to using domestic sources, lived experiences, and lived realities to put together its version of history based on facts. As long as history continues to be on the back burner and we see this as some kind of an elitist peeve, it will remain a storm in the teacup, while a larger storm is brewing out in the society and will affect our lives at a social level and at a very, very personal level.
Said, you, in a sense, cleared the thoughts of many people today by the points that you put forward. I think people will get time to ruminate, think over, form their opinion on the basis of points that you have shared today via this interview on policy and politics. I think this maybe should form into a series of interviews, first but not the last, where we take up such issues, because in a sense, there is a certain agreement, at least on the larger end, that there may be an attempt to drive certain fault lines and, in a sense, impact Indian society. And that is why I think these issues are important. I appreciate you joining us on Policy and Politics today and clearing for everyone these issues. Thank you so much for joining us, Sai. Thank you.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.